This is a political game in the sense that nothing is made up and everything is real.
Maybe I'm just an ignorant European.
It's not just a one-way ticket to utopia.
And I've become pretty convinced that we should all be solar punks.
The utopia got done.
Everything connects to Solarpunk.
Hello everyone, welcome to episode number 3 of Solarpunk Manifesto. Today we are welcoming 4 guest speakers, Alyssum, Max, Borrealis and Nick. Thank you for being here. They are part of an arts collective called Solarpunk Surf Club based in Kentucky. And we discovered Solarpunk Surf Club through their game called Solarpunk Futures. It's a really cool storytelling, role-playing card games. And Maxim and I are really fond of that game, and we actually played it a few times with our classmates and people from our uni. So you describe it as a utopian storytelling tabletop card game where players imagine pathways to a desirable future by collaboratively overcoming real-world challenges. And the goal of the game, you say, is to collectively remember stories that grew into our utopia. So the first question we have for you is, why are you called Surf Club, Solarpunk Surf Club?
Hey everyone, I can take this. There are a few different things that lead into the name, but in part, it's an homage to the history of net art and internet surf clubs, which were group sites, usually a blog, where artists would link to surfed or surfable items on the web and also post some of their original creative work. And we also liked surfing as a metaphor for the sort of oscillation between control and surrender in making. Does anyone else want to elaborate?
As a former rock climber, I always felt a kinship with surfers. There's just like a really similar lifestyle of doing what you love because you love it, regardless of what the prescribed society at large says. So that appealed to me.
And I think one thing that it came from was our first group project was a project called Green Room that used a polysemic definition of the green room. And one of the definitions that we were working with was the green room as that sublime tunnel of a wave that a surfer is kind of ever searching for, a sort of utopian surfer vision.
Could you maybe say a few words about what the green room was so our listeners have a better image of what's happening, what's the utopian aspect of it?
Yeah, so that was a project that we did in conjunction with the Madison Public Library and a particular gallery in one of the library buildings. And that was a project we curated and created an environment for utopian recreation where people could rest, relax, play games together, meet each other in a society that is, increasingly individualized and atomized. And also just experience new ideas through, a curated selection of solarpunk and utopian texts, music, and other artworks. We had originally planned to make Solarpunk Futures the game for this project, but it quickly became a much bigger project. And so we delayed that until, I guess, what ended up being a year and a half later or so.
So maybe before we talk about the game, could you first each introduce yourselves and tell us how you each got into Solarpunk? Did one of you know about Solarpunk before the others? How did the other follow up and felt about it? What were your initial feelings and aspirations toward Solarpunk?
Hi, I'll go first. I'm Nick, and I think I encountered Solarpunk through Max. So around... It's funny that we delineate time this way, but just before COVID, Max and I was living in California and Max was living in Wisconsin, and we were doing a lot of kind of political reading and taking classes together, as well as working on art projects and things. And I think Max introduced me to this kind of emerging genre at the time of solarpunk, and we saw a lot of connections to the political and ecological ideas that we were exploring at the same time. And so it kind of grew organically from there as we gained interest simultaneously in a sort of social, ecological, political analysis and a solarpunk aesthetic analysis, until we were trying to find ways, or looking for ways, to really bring those two groups of people together who I think hadn't really encountered each other.
This is Max. I think I found solarpunk in early grad school. I was in an MFA program, started 2017, and that's when I met Kyle, who's not on this call but is also a member. And I walked into his studio one day, and on his bookshelf he also had, I think it was that anthology Ecopunk, and we had that moment of like the two Spider-Mans pointing at each other. We're like, wait, you're into this? So I think kind of a multiple independent origin story is probably on par for this group, as many other people, I'm sure.
This is Alyssum. I have a background in international environmental policy, and I was also a performer and a dancer and a contortionist working in a circus. And through the circus, I was reading tarot. And so I think that there's a lot of visioning for a better world through various tarot decks. And so I was sort of alerted to the idea of imagining a better future, both through my grad school environmental program as well as performing and tarot world that I was in. And then having the name Solarpunk to kind of hang my hat on, so to speak, just fit really easily and really well with that.
And my name is Borrealis. You can call me Bo, and my pronouns are they, them. I consider myself a social artist, and I have for a long time structured my practice around what I call the queer art of care. And I was a little late to the solarpunk game, actually. I had collaborated with Max a number of times over the years. Max supported a project called Toast that was around gender and sort of community responsibility around that, and had a lot of overlapping political ideas. But to be totally honest, I felt like hanging my hat on solarpunk felt a little bit limiting. I'm annoyingly anti-labelist in some ways. And so it took some convincing for me to understand the social ecological imperatives behind solarpunk and really get a sense of the community of people working towards solutions to social dilemmas. And I've become pretty convinced that we should all be solarpunks. So I was the latest addition to the solarpunk crew, but very excited to keep learning and growing with these folks.
It's cool, thank you. And actually, we have a question on this topic in particular, because you as a collective are engaging in so many different meaningful actions that you've told us about or have been written about. And the fact that you're all united under the term solarpunk says a lot about the fact that you have found that to be the most appropriate umbrella term for you, because some would just call it maybe activism, some would call it social justice, environmental justice, and not necessarily seek to label themselves. Can you maybe elaborate a bit more on why you decided to put that word and not something else, eco-punk, or something that is more maybe straightforward?
I like solarpunk as an intuition pump because it contains within it a gesture towards both the oppositional and the reconstructive, which I see as kind of a core element or facet to an emancipatory political project. I like the dual associations with solar as both energy production and political power. I mean, as Bo said, like all labels are limiting to an extent, but if it's a way that we can signal some of those priorities and it helps us connect with, people like yourselves around the world who are interested in building a similar movement, then that seems like the positives vastly outweigh. What do others think?
I really like the holism of it. I think that there is an aspect of solarpunk that is visual, representational, beautiful, utopian futures. I've always been an avid reader of speculative fiction, and so that that's kind of what drew me into Solarpunk at first, especially since I think to this day, a lot of Solarpunk works remain either short fiction, largely short fiction, or kind of internet artworks. And I think there's an aspect of Solarpunk that's that, and then I think there's an aspect of Solarpunk that is about what you do. I know that the late David Graeber's Twitter bio said, anarchism isn't a thing that I am, it's what you do. And I think that's true of Solarpunk as well. There's an obvious trend when you just Google Solarpunk images. A lot of what comes up is actually just kind of eco-modernism, putting trees on big buildings and things. I'm all for making our built environment more beautiful, but I think the real challenge of Solarpunk is about what you do. And so I think there's a holism in that, in terms of encompassing both organizational work in the community and visual art practices with other people.
I also think that there's an element of just immediate sort of understanding. When you say solarpunk to someone who has never heard the word solarpunk before, they maybe are familiar already with cyberpunk. And so in contrast to cyberpunk, that tends to be kind of dark and dystopian, I think a lot of people just sort of intuitively think that solarpunk is going to be brighter because of the sun and just, more utopian rather than dystopian.
I think one of the things that keeps me coming back to solarpunk and solarpunk communities is the emphasis on prefiguration. And that's not to say that related and interconnected movements aren't also considering how we practice and create worlds today that we want for tomorrow. I do think that solarpunks give that a certain kind of attention that's exciting to me.
Cool. That totally makes sense. And I think for us, the communal aspect indeed of connecting, we just believe that there should be a term, that everyone can associate themselves with, because otherwise there are these real problems of the fragmentation of the left. And I think having a term that could potentially unite us under some sort of a aegis is really important. Now's a good time to circle back to what's it like being a solarpunk in a conservative state, because we just talked about that briefly, but I think it's really interesting to talk about your experiences of coming from Wisconsin to Kentucky, and why did you decide to move there, and what is your experience doing these kind of activities in such historically conservative states. Maybe I'm just ignorant, an ignorant European, and I don't know the state of politics in America, but I've heard.
I get these questions from other Americans as well. I moved from California to Kentucky, and I think I answered somebody a few days ago who asked me this question, that when you're a leftist in the United States, there's not really any leftist states. There's only conservative states in the United States. And I think when I was traveling abroad somewhere, someone was talking about how democratic the United States is and why they wanted to live there, where we had this beautiful two-party system. And I think similarly, it's worth remembering that there's no anti-war party in the United States. There's no pro-everyone having healthcare party in the United States. So anyway, I guess all that is to say, the work is definitely different, but I think less different than you might expect, even other people in the United States who are maybe not as politically activated or politicized.
We've done, I think, two workshops in Kentucky with Solarpunk Futures. One of them was in Lexington, another one was in Berea, just south of Lexington, which went well. There's definitely a receptive community here for this kind of work. We're organizing an exhibition right now that deals with solarpunk, and so we'll see. We'll have a better sense of how the local community responds to that kind of work. I think moving to Kentucky, I had the opportunity to connect with several like-minded organizers who were already based in the South, and they reminded me that, organizers in the South sometimes have a better, a more kind of realistic sense of the political landscape, because the specter of right-wing fascism has never left. And I think in some ways it's a little refreshing to not have the pull towards liberal political strategies and electoralism, and we can do our sort of dual power organizing on our own terms. And so far so good, but to be determined.
Just to build off of that and thinking about whether we're living in a red state or something else, is that the law and policies as they have existed have never been a guarantee to keep people safe. And so I think that there was a lot of fear from family members that we may be moving to a place where particular rights may be more restricted even than the place that we came from. I think that it's important to consider that even if we felt relatively safe in the place that we were in, it doesn't mean that everyone has always felt that way. As the resident, I don't know, I'm always going to be cheerleading the reproductive freedom element of this. I like to pull up the example that Roe never guaranteed safety for people who can get pregnant. And that's true because people can't necessarily afford abortion care, travel for it, get time off. We haven't eradicated medical racism and so on. And so I think that it's important to consider wherever we are living, how we are organizing in a way that builds our own power, perhaps outside of the purview of the state. And just to echo what everyone else has already shared, it's very apparent that there's no lack of organizing happening in Kentucky as in other places that we've lived.
One other thought that I have is I've lived all over the United States. I've lived in Massachusetts, Colorado, California, and I am glad to be back home. And one of the things that people always kind of asked me when I was in other states was, what do you like about Kentucky? Why would you ever move back there? And I feel like one thing that I learned living here growing up was a real sense of humility that I never felt when I was surrounded by more like-minded people. I feel like when I'm in a community of people who sometimes think like me and often don't think like me, it provides the patience and ability to learn how to speak with people wherever they might be coming from and find common ground and build from there. And I think that's really important. And I think that it's lacking in a lot of more blue states.
Right. In this regard, we have only had experience, playing the game. Just to speak about how the workshops have gone so far and wherever in Wisconsin or in Kentucky. We only had the opportunity to play in our beautiful, super international, super leftist university in the city of Paris in France. But what has the response been playing with people who are not so left-leaning, perhaps in these more conservative states, be it Wisconsin or Kentucky? Have you had those kind of experiences? And if so, what have the most surprising interactions with those people have been?
I think that's one of the beauties of the way the game is structured in asking you to suspend your disbelief, to assume utopia has happened. And I think that is ultimately the biggest barrier for most people. And you hear it again and again, conservative rhetoric about this is the way the world is. People are crying over just the facts of life or biology or whatever. And so if you allow people in playing the game to assume we've reached utopia, and honestly, as diverse as those utopias can be, most people have surprisingly similar views of utopia. We haven't run into a lot of conflict in not defining what that utopia is when seeing people play the game who are coming from different perspectives. I think the most challenging I've seen of a game was somebody who almost played it ironically for half of the game, but their ironic playing was either subtle enough or just kind of good enough that they were getting so much positive encouragement from everyone else around the table that I think it ended up being half genuine, at least by the end. So I think that was probably the most challenging time I saw, when somebody was just kind of not comfortable maybe playing a role-playing game or not comfortable imagining utopia, and so they could only play it from the distance of irony, but they still played, and I imagine still learned some things, and certainly there was a lot of good conversation after the game, as it always happens with every group we've played with.
One time when we were playing, there was a young person who was from a very religious, conservative background. And one of the cards that she drew was for hacker. And so in the game, there's a bunch of different ways that you can be in the world to make a difference. And hacker was one of those things. Sometimes it's gardener or teacher, healer, all kinds of different things. And in this young woman's mind, hacker was inherently a terrible, bad thing. And so she was kind of struggling with how you could take a terrible thing and make it a tool to help the world. And yet, somehow, through the storytelling process, she was able to get there. It was really interesting. I felt like my inclination was to be like, no, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Subverting the state by hacking into isn't necessarily a bad thing. But she got there on her own as we continued the game. And that was really kind of a lesson for me in keeping my mouth shut and just like letting people play with the tools.
Borrealis, did you also have something to say?
Sure. Yeah. One of the things that we offer when we're queuing up a workshop gameplay session is that this is a political game in the sense that nothing is made up and everything is real. In some ways, that can heighten tension when players are encountering ideas that maybe they're not sure about, maybe they don't necessarily agree with. One example that comes to mind is a gameplay session where there was a question about whether mass incarceration was a social problem, which is very interesting, not necessarily a perspective I was anticipating. But if we start from the premise that this is real, I think that the social challenges part of the game can be a conversation starter to establish what is our understanding of this issue, to what extent do we agree or need further evidence or what have you. And then also in playing with that tension between a game, which some may feel is a kind of totally imaginary activity, like a totally imaginary kind of space, bringing that imagination in with the tension, again, of real issues like the water crisis, I think that there's something productive that can happen in that in-between space where we're establishing that this is something that we can address, even if we believe in some part of ourselves that it's not really there or we're never really going to be able to solve it. And in my experience with these sessions, something comes of it, whether that's some amount of hope that we can share with one another, not to hope wash and eliminate any conflict we might have around how we want to solve these issues, but it can, at minimum, raise consciousness, put it on people's radar. And I think overall, and I could be just having wishful thinking here, y'all can chime in if I'm wrong about this, but it seems like even when there are questions about how much we agree about the premise, something positive comes from bridging the gap between what we've been trained to think is possible and what might actually be possible if we use our imagination.
One thing I can add is that we tried to design the challenges to be sort of objective in the sense that they're not just problems that people from a specific ideological framework would deem to be challenges, but there are challenges that really everyone should acknowledge the existence of, even if we have different ideas about where they come from or how to address them. So instead of some of the big ism kind of words, we tried to take it to one degree of additional specificity. Like jumping back to the thing Nick said at the beginning of this part of assuming utopia. We've taken failure off the table and we've assumed that our people have overcome this challenge and we're telling the story of how they went about doing that. And that framework, I think, is pretty effective in terms of getting people thinking collaboratively, getting people thinking imaginatively about possibility, rather than mired in the limitations of like mainstream political discourse.
Yeah. But so this idea you describe as backcasting, right? Like the opposite of forecasting, and the fact that when you position yourself from the standpoint of utopia, what comes out and the conversation might be more fertile than if you go the other way. And I remember we were discussing, Maxim, before doing the podcast, when we were discussing about politics in general and like being on the left, on the right. I was saying that I think that like We all have similar needs and desires and basic needs, but it's just like how we make sense of how we get those needs, how the society functions, our level of understanding of things, of education, that shapes our politics. And I feel like this exercise, when you accept that there's a problem and you're forced to imagine how this could be solved, even if in your life you would cut off the conversation earlier, the idea of border is the one that comes to my mind the most. Like, people dismiss it as utopian, as something that cannot exist. And this game forces you to think about it and to discuss it and to understand what it means. And I think it's really powerful. And it's what Solarpunk is about, actually. It's what the game is about. It's the process that you have throughout the game, but it's also why Solarpunk is so interesting.
Yeah, I think more than anything, it ends up creating really interesting conversations and really productive conversations around these political topics and how we might overcome them. As you just said, like, a lot of times these conversations would get cut off much earlier. Or if they didn't get cut off, they'd be a one-way lecture by someone telling the other person how it should be or how it is. Or it'd be an argument in which both people are just hardening their existing positions. But by removing yourself one step and saying, this is a game, even if it's a real game about where everything's real, it creates the possibility where people can play and play with solutions without feeling like they have to own that idea for the rest of time. And that ends up being much more collaborative and interesting, I think, than an argument or a lecture.
And I think in this regard, actually, it's interesting to speak about the importance of barriers, because you mentioned this. It's maybe we're going to introduce the game a bit better by explaining the fact that in one step, you have to imagine what kind of hindrances your ancestor came across when trying to achieve the utopian state. What were you thinking when you put that into the design? Indeed, because imagining problems when you're backtracking, when you're kind of just reflecting on how you resolve them, is sometimes much more flexible than in the other direction. So how has your experience been maybe teaching workshops when people are like, there was a problem, but we actually solved it? Does that give people maybe a sense of hope or inspire them a little?
Yeah, I think, creating the barriers was something we actually I don't think we had in the first edition of the game, or didn't have in the same way. And it was something that we wanted to re-emphasize in the second edition that is much more common, the larger printing that we did through Kickstarter. That edition, we wanted to emphasize people predicting how us as in utopians, leftists, aren't the only people imagining a different future. And our opponents are going to respond in various ways. And so I think we wanted to make sure that people were thinking about that. And I think, if nothing else, it creates a more satisfying narrative too. Just thinking, it's not just a one-way ticket to utopia, but we're gonna face pushback, we're gonna face challenges, and there are gonna be other things that people have to do to overcome them along the way.
I think naming barriers or having an opportunity to articulate barriers is a form of political education. When we're talking about a topic, a social challenge comes up, not everyone around the table is going to have expert knowledge on the interlocking forces of domination that are making that a social challenge. And so it is an opportunity for peer-to-peer education to articulate barriers, but it's also a way to validate and, again, work against the hope washing that can come from emphasizing hope, emphasizing prefiguration, emphasizing how possible this is. And I think it's a way to kind of bring us into that concrete utopia where this is actually possible. And yes, there are barriers, and here's what they look like. So, from my perspective, working through the workshops, it's a form of articulation and validation as much as the other things that Nick mentioned.
But yeah, I think just on failures, I think it also validates current struggles. It makes our current reality even more real, because you're basically referring to everyone right now who is, failing and doing things not in a perfect way, but are still trying to do things. And I think that's what makes it really powerful.
And we had a question about the fact that you decided to make a game of all things. I think we already had the opportunity to discuss a few things about why maybe playing a game is the most optimal in this particular case, but we wanted to hear your thoughts on what went into the development of the Solarpunk Futures game, maybe starting as a sub project in the green room that you took out and developed into such a beautiful gameplay?
We had independently been interested in social practice and new media as sort of the contemporary art field that we're drawn to and interested in working in. New media just means that we accept that anything has the potential to be art, and social practice is often referred to as taking relationships as a medium. There's a lot more we could say about that. I think it actually implies a deeper critique of all art in the sense that everything is a social relation, but we can come back to that if you want. So a game combines sort of both, right? A game could be in the field of contemporary art, could be seen as new media, although I would actually argue that it's quite ancient. We looked at some games that are 5,000 years old that are, beautiful works of, objects, sculptural works that we looked at, Renaissance games. The Surrealists had a series of games. So there's an art history to games, even though you might call them new media. And then social practice, games inaugurate a set of social relations, sort of in a microcosmic sense. And that idea, I think, drives a lot of our work. Also, games are just sounded fun and interesting. It's a way to reach an often depoliticized audience. As Nick had said, there's a kind of equality of participation, that sort of epistemological equality where all people can contribute equally to something rather than lecturing. Games as practice. Bo was talking about the political education possibilities of games, and I think that maps onto more like anarchist theories of education more generally through kind of self-directed exploration. There's games, again, thinking within games as a kind of artistic medium, similar to artists' books, where we're working within and against the conventions of an established form to create something fresh. I think those are the main reasons why we chose a game.
Okay. Then when you're researching, did you come across any games that have historically been used for organizing, perhaps? Actually, I was just curious about this because indeed you mentioned a few games, actually the Renaissance and the Surrealist one I've not ever heard about. If you could just tell us maybe a little, give us a sneak peek of what those are, and just give us what the inspiration was behind using or behind looking into the ancient board games like the Senate and Mesopotamian Game of Ur and Game of Goose and such, because I don't think it comes across like especially when you see the board, because we were looking into it, right, after reading your references to it, and we were like, okay, how is this prefigurative?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say, using games for organizing, because I think all games, and we talk about this in a course we teach, but, all art is organizational in a way. It organizes different kinds of social relations, kind of like what Max was saying about social practice art. And so I think, not all games were sort of liberatory, organizing a liberatory future. Chess is a great game, and but originally based on Indian war formations. And I think some of the other kind of like ancient games that we encountered were, even way before chess, I believe. Senate was a game from ancient Egypt. They're, I think, more in the category of being explicitly pedagogical is the Game of the Goose from England in the 15th century. And that game was, explicitly about an educational game, and also featured some pretty, beautiful artwork in a time where, mass production of a game like this wasn't really an option. So each game was kind of crafted. And then the Surrealist games, I think, also, an example of games that were explicitly about political education, about stretching the imagination, about creating the possibilities for change in a world that felt like it was locked into a status quo, which I think rhymes a lot with what we're trying to do with Solarpunk Futures. As for tarot, yeah, I think, tarot has a really interesting history and contemporary life And there are many different ways that tarot is used, but as you mentioned, cartomancy, this idea of filling each card with layers of metaphor and meaning that can be drawn upon in relation to other cards or other questions in the case of tarot. In Solarpunk Futures, you are largely drawing the cards in relation to each other, plus some of the story that you're crafting around it. And so if you draw a challenge card of the water crisis and then ancestor card of a healer and a tool card of, equipment libraries, there's kind of there's so many different directions that you can take with any one of the cards. And in limiting your options by drawing only one, you kind of have some creative constraints at the same time as you have just a world of possibilities for ways that you could recombine those different cards in context of each other. Maybe Alyssum has more to say about tarot. I don't know.
Bo talked about working on crypt time. I'm also disabled, and my disability is more of just how much energy I have. And so I have been working on 2 tarot decks, and they're going very slowly because of crypt time. But yeah, I think one of the things that really draws me to card games and tarot in particular is the remix culture that is associated with it. You have 78 cards, they're the same cards every time. And so there's this formality and this tradition that you're carrying on, and yet you're taking your own creativity and infusing these old things with what matters now. And so taking a hierarchical and very Christian, even Catholic kind of format and monarchical format of the tarot originally, and making it more relevant to where we are now and where we want to be. And so you can kind of take what works and, make what doesn't work something that does work. There's a interconnectedness there, and both to the past and our ancestors, as well as to the future and who we hope future generations will get to be. It's a contemplative practice, I think, in kind of recognizing those things.
Good moment to briefly mention that Solarpunk Futures is released under a Creative Commons license, so if we could be so lucky as tarot to have so many different people remixing and finding new ways to create Solarpunk Futures, that would be very exciting.
Yeah.
I'm sure somebody would have copyrighted tarot cards if they could, as we don't yet live in the Solarpunk future.
Yeah, I mean the Solarpunk tarot deck is really exciting. I'm really excited for it to be released. No pressure, but maybe Alyssum, you could tell us a bit about your insights on the spiritual aspect of Solarpunk. How do you link both?
This is a huge question, and one that we've been tossing around together for months. As Max mentioned, we're working on a Solarpunk spirituality writing project. And so I think that the cleanest, simplest way to express Solarpunk spirituality is to say that it's not one thing. I think it's very personal, and I think that whereas Solarpunk is sort of this inherently community-oriented framework to look at life and engage, I think spirituality is a way to maintain and even grow our individual natures. The spirituality is how we interact with the community as individuals. And that can mean so many things for so many different people. And I think that's one of the beautiful things too.
We wanted to talk about one of the concepts that was mentioned, I think, by Nick. I mean, just now, a few minutes ago. You said that games kind of reflect our societies, that they tell us a bit about the mindsets and the zeitgeist of the time, perhaps. So we had a question about Solarpunk Futures. What mindsets should Solarpunk Futures put us in, and which mindsets is it not about?
That's an interesting question. I think that I like to imagine people feeling playful and powerful after playing it, that they have some power with the really quite often mundane or practical, very within reach tools that are included in the game. I personally, as someone who is trying to think about how we can change this society we live under, frequently feel overwhelmed by the amount of things there are to do, things there are to change, and things that will get in our way. And I think when I play Solarpunk Futures, I often feel a relief in knowing that even with my individual perspective and my two tools in conjunction with the 4 to 7 other people that I'm playing with, the utopia got done. We reached utopia, and it was through coming together in different roles and focusing on different aspects and building something together. And so I think I often have a clarity in that sense, and a sort of sense of relief and a sense of excitement about finding other people who have diverse interests, who we can confederate with and build that utopia together. Does anyone else have any thoughts on what kinds of moods or vibes we want to create with the game, or don't?
I know we specifically wanted to work against the kinds of competitive games where you're competing to drive your fellow players into poverty or colonize other land. But I think, to Nick's point, having players see themselves as historical agents, that the decisions that they make have ramifications in changing the world and leaving a legacy for their ancestors. That's one of the postscript reflections at the end of the game, is challenging people directly that you will be a future ancestor. How do you want to be remembered? That's sort of the most aspirational mindset that I could think of that I would want someone to be in playing the game.
Before we kind of go into your more personal experience of being activists and organizers, and that would be the next chapter. But before we move into the next chapter, I had a question that is linked to a feedback that we got actually during playing the game. So one of the people I was playing with, she missed actually something to focus on, like a map in front of her, kind of like you're used in the board games that you just put your characters on, you move them. And you've mentioned before that you actually wanted to do like suites for the game, for the cards. Can you tell us maybe a bit about what are the upcoming phases for Solarpunk Futures, and whether you've implemented any feedback of that sort into the upcoming versions?
Yeah, so I think at this time, being a small collective of artists, we are focused on other projects. I think there is certainly a possibility for a future edition of Solarpunk Futures. We definitely hear often enough that folks would be interested in getting a version that weren't able to. We did actually just collaborate with a magazine based out of Knoxville, Tennessee called Murgoat Magazine, and they printed an edition of the game that people can kind of cut out of the magazine in collaboration with us, and that was very exciting.
It's also available for free to be printed out in PDF form on the website, which is thefuture.wtf.
One addition that from all the workshops that has stuck with me is the suggestion that someone offered of having ancestors be able to ask each other questions earlier on in the game. I thought that was quite a good suggestion, and will strongly consider that if in the event of a third edition.
As for kind of a board or something more tactile to move around, I don't think that is really in the works. There was some consideration at some point of creating a sort of like a whiteboard timeline that people could utilize. And I think for certain groups that could be a great thing that they could easily create with a blank sheet of paper. I think when we were trying to imagine it or play test with that idea, people kind of jumped around in the timeline too much that it didn't end up I don't know, it ended up maybe being a distraction and creating all these meta conversations about where in a timeline things would go. But we'd be open to other people's suggestions and ideas. Certainly, we have like a running list of things. Should we print a future edition of small changes we might make?
What was the mashup that we did?
Oh yeah, that's right. At the end of the game book, there's kind of a primary game mode, and then there's a couple kind of supplementary game modes. One that didn't make it into the book that we played with was a map-based game based on a free set of map games that we found in a zine of map games. And it was sort of an archaeological game. So you can spread out any set of oracle cards or tarot cards or even playing cards if you want across a large sheet of paper. You draw out boundaries and then you dig through the archaeology, and as you uncover cards, they suggest layers of meaning that happened on that spot on the map, and you kind of draw in representations of those events or buildings or peoples that occurred there. So I think that was a fun, more tactile and map-based version of the game that we played once.
That's really cool. It actually reminds me of an art project I saw in Rotterdam last summer. It was basically a set of objects from the 60s or even contemporary objects that you had to imagine that you were in the future, and you see this vacuum cleaner, like really futuristic looking from the 70s. You know how they like to make it really nice and sleek. But you had to look at it and you would be like, what would that be used for if you've never come across it? Because you live in a future where there's no dust, so you have to imagine what something like that would be used for. But actually, in terms of maps, the reason that the person was kind of seeking for that experience had to do with the fact that we have a super international university here, and I was playing in with 5 people, all from different countries. And the problem that you usually come across if you have people from different continents is that they all imagine their ancestors to be on their continents. So then you have a person from Kenya imagine about an ancestor from Kenya, China in China, Europe in Europe, North America in North America. And then it actually, usually the timeline, in my experience of conducting the game, was never a problem because people just kind of let go in the 4th stage of the fact that they were not really in the same timeline. I just tell them in the beginning, oh, you can inspire somebody, or like your ancestor could have inspired another ancestor, doesn't really matter. But in the end, no, everyone kind of plays in the same time frame. But the geographical aspect is something that at least our classmates kind of struggled with. And that's, I think, why the person was seeking some kind of a central focal point in which people could come together and perhaps maybe think about, okay, if there's a map, then how on the map can we collaborate, and or something like that. How can we geographically connect and organize to achieve a common utopia?
We just need to tell them that this is the future Pangea.
We encourage people to break the game, or to elaborate whatever sort of additions you need to make it more relevant and interesting to you. So I would encourage, if that person wanted to make a map as an orienting device to help players build their collaborative story, I would absolutely encourage that. We distribute a survey after the workshops to kind of measure like what people are getting out of their experience. And one of the things we ask about is if people practiced caring dialogue and consent-based decision-making. So I think that that's something that could sort of blur the borders of in or outside of the fiction. Is this something that the players need to play effectively? Then yes, we want and encourage that support.
Cool. All right. So now I think we're gonna talk about your experience with activism, because we've read bits and pieces about the fact that you, besides your artistic practice as a collective, you're also all activists, and we wanted to know if you've come across, similarly to Solarpunk Futures, of any unorthodox formats of organizing or community building that left an impression or inspired you.
Well, I'm hearing kind of a two-part question. One is the other formats that we've encountered that are inspiring, and then the other one is like our personal history of activism and how that informs our work. On the first part, I think Cassie Thornton's project, The Hologram, comes to mind as something that we were actually on a panel together once, billed as Solarpunk. Cassie says that Solarpunk doesn't directly inspire her work, but I think the hologram is pretty Solarpunk. We included it on our curriculum for the ISC, so sorry, Cassie, you're a Solarpunk. But that's a very, very cool project. You should look it up. It's like a peer-to-peer social practice project inspired by the solidarity clinics that emerged in Thessaloniki after the financial crisis. And it takes that model of social organizing for holistic health. But that's very interesting. We went through, they have like an online training course that we went through at one point, which was also very cool. As far as like, history of politicization and political activity, I have a lot of experience with electoralism and seeing ultimately the dead ends of electoralism. I've worked on national campaigns, state campaigns, got sort of disillusioned down to the level of local organizing, have run a number of school board campaigns, city alder campaigns, and even seeing, quote unquote, good people get into office and having their agency be so structurally limited by bureaucracy, by our, misrepresentative system of our constitutionally limited republic in the United States, aka the American Empire. I think just got really, disillusioned and was searching for alternatives. I was in grad school at the same time and getting heavy theoretical doses of post-structuralism. So I was very well equipped to deconstruct, to analyze discourse, but I didn't really have any vision of like where to go. And I think it was around my last year in school that I independently found the Institute for Social Ecology and the body of thought known as social ecology and the work of philosopher Murray Bookchin, and learned about that thought had inspired the Kurdish freedom movement in Rojava, and started taking pretty much every online course they offered. Took Ecology of Freedom reading group, got really interested in communalism and dual power, and did a lot of that with Nick. And that was a major, source of inspiration in making this move to Kentucky to decide to live and work communally and try to, try our hand at local dual power organizing.
Yeah, I can sort of add to that. I think, almost any kind of practice or art can be politicized or solarpunked, to be more specific. This is part of what we try and facilitate, really, with a group of people through a class that we're teaching at the Institute for Social Ecology that's coming up, and people can sign up for it. I think the Zapatistas are very inspiring in terms of some of the art, the stories, the activities that they do, and the way that a playfulness and artisticness infuses everything. They recently sailed across the ocean to land in Spain, France, and claim it as their own, as a, social commentary on the way in which Europeans previously did so to the South, or to South America, Central America, and the Americas broadly. And more than that, they were there to plant a seed of freedom and liberation across Europe and learn from peers and organizations and organizers across Europe as kind of comrades, people who are kind of pursuing the same dreams of freedom in their own locales. To my like specific political experience, I've been, similar to Max, I've been involved in kind of electoral politics and whatnot. More so, I've been involved in tenant organizing, both in DC and then in Oakland, California, and now in Lexington here. And kind of like what I was saying, where any art, any practice can be solarpunked and kind of turned into a political project. Bo organizes sewing circles. If you like watching films, those can become opportunities to discuss political implications, or book clubs. I recently was kind of learning a lot of carpentry and kind of like DIY activities. And so a number of people, and along with myself, got together and started a tool library here in Lexington that I think helps provide maybe not the means of production, but a means of production to the people of Lexington, and empowers people to help themselves learn new skills. Some people use it to make some income. They can borrow a lawnmower and mow some lawns and take care of their families. So I think there's so much possibility, and I think the opportunity to take what you already love doing or things you're already interested in and find ways to solarpunk them is really quite limitless.
Yeah, before I got sick with a complex chronic illness, I was an authenticity coach. And one of the things that I was working with clients on is not just being authentic to yourself to kind of make your life better for yourself, but also doing so because it gives permission to other people to live their authentic life. Being an example of living the way that you want to have your life be is so powerful, and I think a point of power that we give up much too readily. We talk a lot about prefiguring, and I think that's what we are doing here. We're trying, let's see, Nick, Max, Bo, and I bought a duplex together. So we have our own living spaces, and then we share all of the outdoor space. So we garden together, we host book clubs in our shared space. And by doing the things that we love doing and inviting others to join, I think that we are kind of doubling down for ourselves on what is important. And I know that we have inspired other people to kind of do the same for themselves in their lives and kind of spread a more solarpunk way of living here in Lexington.
That's really cute. So speaking of prefigurative communities, so I think, Nick, you mentioned the Zapatista, which we should contact if they're in Paris. We've been looking at, what kind of communities that do solarpunk things we could interview and get on the podcast. And so we were wondering if you had other ideas of interesting places where there's a tightly knit community that have like a solarpunk inclination to their activity. And I think you mentioned Cooperation Jackson, and they have a website, so we looked a bit into it, but we were kind of curious about what you know about them and their work, or if you had any other ideas.
Yeah, Cooperation Jackson has been very inspiring for us. We had the opportunity to go down there and support their various activities, Freedom Farm, Community Land Trust, People's Assemblies, things like that, for a couple weeks 2 years ago. I don't know that Cooperation Jackson would refer to themselves as solarpunks or how aware they are of solarpunk, but I definitely think what they're doing is very in line with a solarpunk ethos. They're kind of mixing high-tech, low-tech, and with a heavy dose of social technologies towards a more liberatory future in one of the blackest and poorest cities in America, and very intentionally so. And I think they're definitely running into like limitations and pushback from the state, and they are, finding new ways to do things, learning new lessons, sharing those lessons with other people, and they've been very inspiring to us. I think that a very solarpunk-oriented podcast I've been listening to is Future Ecologies. They are really thinking about, how the ecological crisis and social crises are intimately interlinked. The movement in Rojava, or more broadly, the acronym is escaping me.
AAN?
AAN.
Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria.
Okay. Those people are under some of the worst, most oppressive conditions of war and constant attacks from Turkey and drone strikes, are building a free society and liberating people from the terrors of ISIS and the Syrian state and other kinds of all the other it's not like any of the statist regimes in the area are liberatory. So I think that's very inspiring and very amazing what they're doing there.
I think generally a lot of native wisdom and native ethos kind of fits in a solarpunk narrative. I encourage people to learn more about their own native practices and traditions and those around you, wherever you may live, whether that's your personal, historical, traditional world or not. But yeah, there's a lot of crossover with native wisdom, I think, and solarpunk.
And you're not just talking about like American Indians here. You're talking about like European indigeneity, which was crushed by common enclosures and Catholic imperialism. And yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, what's coming to mind for me are some other places that we've taken the game. Like we actually brought the game to Chiapas in southern Mexico, and there's a collective there in Balache, who I would call very solarpunk. I don't know if they refer to themselves that way. Let's see. Nick brought it to the Dual Power Gathering. I think these activist gatherings can be little micro utopias, possibilities for new sets of social relations to emerge. We brought it to forest defense in Lutzerat, which is now sadly ended. But again, like similar to that idea of like the ZOD or the temporary autonomous zone, a forest defense camp, that was extremely solarpunk. The infrastructure that people had been able to build up, the level of direct democracy in the decision making, the sort of collective autonomy in terms of like, they had like a system of compost toilets and clear instructions for how to change out the sawdust or whatever in the toilet to sort of reset it. And nobody had assigned work, but everything was clearly laid out where you could kind of just plug into the system. I thought that was very inspiring.
But you guys are doing a docufiction film shorts with actual, like where you're filming and documenting actual
communalistic experiments.
Yeah, so that connects back to Cooperation Jackson and at least in North America, the Symbiosis Network or Symbiosis Federation is a North American federation of different groups and collectives loosely under the banner of libertarian socialism, interested in a kind of municipal communalist politics that they're building material base outside of capitalism in the state, everything from food autonomy and care work to worker self-organization and mutual aid. So I would definitely look into that. That's who we haven't started that project in earnest yet. We ended up starting to work on a different film locally here in Lexington, but I'm very much interested in pursuing that.
And as Bo mentioned, one project often bleeds into the other. I can imagine this film creating the conditions in which we can create the next, either through showing people a vision of what we're hoping to achieve or making connections to new people. And similarly, I think the film project, what we're loosely calling the Free Earth film cycle, would be empowered in part by Solarpunk Futures as a way to facilitate the co-creation of utopian stories with these communities. So in combination with the work they're already doing, we would be co-imagining their most utopian dreams with them. So I think that's a small piece of what we hope to do with that film project, and think a good elucidation of how all these projects, we hope, continue to kind of build off each other and work together.
But speaking of prefiguration, I think we'd like to speak a little bit about all of your experiences with activism as a form of prefiguration. Borrealis, we have read about your recently produced installation called Kinfabula, where you explore queer kinship. And in the context of solarpunk, this very interesting prefiguration of social relations, in fact. A few questions that you mention that you aim to explore are how queer kinship could be a liberatory myth towards co-constructing the futures we want, and how might it not? So can you share your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, and I'll give a little bit of background to that work if that's helpful. I was originally invited by a gallery to activate a space and invite folks from the community into the gallery space to think about queer community and kinship. And that was slated before COVID lockdown started. And as you might imagine, the show was delayed and delayed, in part because everything was delayed, but also because of my own health situation and needing to take additional precautions, which would otherwise be complicated by a social project. And so there are layers of thinking about communal safety that came into play from COVID in particular that casts a particular light or shadow, depending on how you look at it, over the Confabula project. So just want to give some of that context. In part, on an individual level, I felt a little bit abandoned as an immunocompromised, disabled person, thinking about who my kin may be, queer kin or otherwise, and really started to question what some of these words mean when we put them together. What do we mean when we say queer kinship? And what kind of myths are we telling that disguise our histories? And which myths are we telling that can build up the futures that we want to see? Without getting into the weeds around some of the specific references, the gallery's namesake was an artist who created a mural in northern Wisconsin that is the gayest thing I've ever seen in my life, but is lumberjacks kind of brawling with each other, northern Wisconsin. And it's really exciting and gay, but also sort of masks the displacement that happened through settlement in that region. And so it got me thinking about the ways that queer folks are or are not supporting each other by being real about our histories, and that to say queer is not necessarily a totally descriptive and unifying identity category. And then mapping onto that, how things play out in our daily life, thinking about all of our queer and trans kin who've been captured by the state and are imprisoned. And so the installation itself was made to look a bit like a theatrical stage. There was sort of this nook with wallpaper that we designed and plastered over the walls, sconces and candlelight, almost like a memorial sort of setting. We had a TV playing some things on it, as well as a collection of books that were meant to be educational materials around abolition. But the most important part about the installation was that there was a social participation component, trying to navigate how to genuinely connect with each other and have an opportunity to participate in our own narratives and myth making without necessarily putting any of us in danger during a very precarious time in terms of community health and COVID. So we had scripts made up in zines in the installation that were mostly, but only partially written. And towards the end of the script, there would be blank lines where guests could kind of fill in the blank with their own narratives. And I think the connection to Solarpunk with this project is that we focused a lot on the social technologies involved in maintaining our communities. One of the blank lines lists social technologies like community meals, mutual aid networks, and blank. And the idea being that the guests who are engaging with the show have their own ideas about the social technologies that keep us safe. And I'll admit, part of what I sort of reinflect onto and through Solarpunk is a need for authentic relationship building, finding ways to be really honest with each other, but also build the skills that we need to keep each other safe. In Solarpunk conversations, my impression is that there are debates or discussions or brainstorming sessions or, just sort of generative thinking about the low tech versus high tech futures that we may need to engage with to navigate climate crisis. And I think that part of the tech that we are thinking about and ought to continue to be thinking about is the social technology. I think myth making is a social technology that helps us understand how we want to be in community with each other and where we might go into the future, for example. But hopefully that gives a little bit of a picture of what a rather multifaceted project was really trying to do and how it connects to Solarpunk.
Everything connects to Solarpunk. But we also heard that you are developing, together with Max, a podcast that would maybe elaborate on this a little bit more, right? Because it is one of the biggest parts of Solarpunk. actually to be explored, because oftentimes, we have conversations with solarpunk enthusiasts or solarpunk activists, and they all say, well, all the problems nowadays are not technological problems. They're just social problems, actually, that we're unable to resolve due to lack of A, B, and C. And probably social interactions are one of the core problems that we have to solve before we start moving forward. So could you maybe tell us a bit more about that, Max and you, and how you're hoping to, what kind of topics are you hoping to explore, and what is the long-term goal for the podcast?
Yeah, I would love to. So CareTactics was conceived of or imagined a few years ago, actually, and there's a little bit of a pattern in some of our, or at least my recent work, that things are moving on crypt time. And so we've been working on this for a long, long time, and we're just now pulling the first episode together. But the podcast is called CareTactics, and our idea is that CareTactics are everyday habits, contemplative practices, and direct actions that can help us prefigure a more free and caring society. And so the hope is to combine political education with on the ground action that people may be able to take or practice to build relationships and, again, the skills that we might want for a better future. So some of the episodes that we've brainstormed so far relate to reproductive autonomy and solidarity for reproductive freedom, how we might support political prisoners and think about abolition, how our food systems and soil health play into each other, how autonomous health movements like solidarity clinics may be a path into the future, but trying to kind of bridge some pretty large buckets of political imperatives with things that people can really practice either on their own or with the folks around them. For the first episode, we're calling it Be Queer, Support Abortion Access. This podcast episode, like I mentioned, is around solidarity for reproductive freedom. And so we're talking a lot about how the struggle for gender affirming care and wellness among trans and queer communities is interconnected to reproductive freedoms like the full spectrum of reproductive health options like abortion, and how finding the interconnectedness between this work might support all of us in moving towards a more free and caring society. So we are working through interviewing organizers as well as artists, and then talking through some specific care tactics with members of the Surf Club and kind of weaving that all together into a podcast format. Max, did I miss anything in explaining that super amazing, awesome forthcoming project?
No, you did a fantastic job. I think I have a background in music and sound art, so I'm kind of interested in bringing a little bit of a working against some of the conventions of the podcast and exploring its potentialities as an audio format. But the proof will be in the pudding on that, if I can pull that off. I was just going to add, though, that we, just to make some other connections with Beau's work and Confabula, that we actually played Solarpunk Futures in the Confabula installation.
Right.
On a special challenge of the nuclear family. So specifically kind of working with that idea of queer kinship and how we might, work past, in a solarpunk way, work past the challenges of the present society into a utopian horizon. And I think another sort of formal device that links Beau's one-act play, or sorry, not a one-act play, one-room play? What is it, Beau?
Technically, I think that it would be considered a play in 3 acts. We can call it whatever we want.
Anyway,
It was a
I'm
little
sorry.
play.
No, just cut that part. Never mind. In the play, that use of Mad Lib style phrasal templates where people sort of fill in the blank with their own contributions and ideas is another sort of formal linkage with Solarpunk Futures. In our second edition, we created a note card where people can essentially do the same thing and fill in the blank to sort of scaffold their stories. You don't have to use that, but it was something that we had added from the first to the second edition based on participant feedback. And actually, it's something that we're carrying forward into forthcoming projects. We're doing some collective writing around the topic of spirituality as it intersects with solarpunk, and we had the idea to turn it into into a zine that would also have some sort of blank spaces. It's written in dialogue format. In response to each question that we kind of all take a turn answering, people reading the zine would have the opportunity to contribute their own ideas.
I think you'll get a sense as you hear us talking that the edges between projects are a little bit blurry. So even though there is a box set with the game, Solarpunk Futures, as Max is saying, there's linkage to how we formatted other kinds of projects. And those ideas are really building off of each other and kind of moving back and forth between those spaces. So might make it a little tricky to explain to everyone what we're doing, but I just want to acknowledge that there is a little bit of fuzziness that we hope is productive.
Yeah, I think one of the main purposes of this podcast is to show the different ways in which you can enact Solarpunk in real life. So don't worry. I think it's actually justly showcasing, the fact that everyone can engage in a variety of ways, and that is the beauty of Solarpunk.
I just wanted to ask you, Bo, about your social care work, because when you look at your beautiful website, which explain all the kind of activities of care that you're involved with different people for different reasons, like postpartum care, abortion care, I find it really inspiring, and I've actually never seen that because it's not really something that's present in my environment around me. So I just wanted to know, how does it work being a social caretaker or just a caretaker of people?
I'll back up to maybe 4 years ago or so. I had an opportunity to train in full spectrum birth work. Full spectrum meaning supporting all of the options and outcomes related to birth. And when I went through that training, I quickly realized that abortion care was a very politicized form of healthcare. Probably don't need to explain that one to a lot of people. And I saw so many linkages to what I've experienced as a trans person and a disabled person, trying to navigate healthcare systems and having that healthcare be politicized, see that happen with my peers. And so, full disclosure, a lot of my work does revolve around supporting folks through pregnancy release and pregnancy loss. But that experience of pregnancy release and pregnancy loss is so interconnected to the wholeness of our lives and our health. And that comes up through politics, but also just through medicine and how we take care of each other, thinking about how plant medicine supports folks' hormonal health. One might imagine how that might pertain to gender affirming care as well as to the care of menstruators. And then thinking about how politicized the medicine related to, let's say, self-managed abortion has become. I'll just go on a quick tangent to say that there are two primary methods to release a pregnancy using pills. One is with mifepristone and misoprostol, and the other is with a different dosage and protocol of misoprostol alone. And I mention misoprostol or misoprostol because that medicine is also used to treat or prevent postpartum hemorrhage, and it's also used to induce labor for planned pregnancies, as well as being a tool to support releasing a pregnancy that's not wanted. And so there are all these political and tangible ways that these different forms of healthcare are woven into each other, that even if I wanted to separate out my work around gender affirming care or my work around abortion care from the rest of the reproductive equation, it would be impossible. And that's not even getting to talking about the ways that our reproductive health is intertwined with environmental health and, this full multi-species ecology underway, and just thinking about the interconnectedness between, I guess we could say, climate justice and reproductive justice or freedom. So I could get into specifics of what it looks like on the ground, but I just wanted to really highlight that the way that our healthcare is politicized and the way that we learn the skills that we need to keep each other safe, to me, are so intertwined. And the specific outlet, like abortion care or trans care, is a little less important than overall building the skills and knowledge that we need as a community to be empowered through our information and our ability to take care of each other.
Yeah. I mean, we'll make sure we link the different, your website and and also the podcast so that people can check it out and have more details.
All right, cool. So we today had the honor to speak about so many hope-instilling things. And for us, for Lolo and I, it's also, this podcast has been some sort of a tool to dig out the eternal hope that has been lost in our generation. And you know, you as people who are there on the ground, you are not just philosophizing or theorizing about these things. You're really engaging with people who are also organizing, who are also trying to move our societies in better directions. Can you maybe give our listeners who have a little bit less hope and less incentive to participate in these kind of activities something that gives you hope and that you think is inspiring?
When I was working on environmental issues directly, it could be very, very disheartening, just the content of the material and the projects that I was engaging in. And what kept me going was seeing so many people doing really wonderful work. And there are a bazillion different environmental issues that you could choose from, and every single niche has some human being, if not many, many human beings who are working, doing incredibly creative and helpful work. And it's the same for social justice issues. Yeah, I find my inspiration and reason for continuing in the efforts of my compatriots.
I heard you all in your interview with Andrew mention the Václav Havel quote about hope, not optimism. That was something that we had also shared in our online course. And it seems to also be inspired by a Ernst Bloch quote where he made a distinction about hope, where hope is not confidence. Hope isn't confidence that what you're doing will turn out, but it's the sense that you're doing the right thing and you'll persist in that anyway. I think so much of our work comes back to relationships. I'll tell anyone who wants to hear that the best thing I've ever done is move to live with my collaborators. Yeah, having, even though we're not able to do this like day in, day out, we have, wage work, disability, the pressures of living in the American empire. I think having those relationships as a place to ground myself and return to is really the main thing I would point to as like what keeps me going, what I get the most enjoyment out of on a day-to-day level, how I refine my vision for what it is I'm even working towards.
Yeah, I think Max said something very similar to what I was going to say. I don't always find keeping that distinction between hope and optimism in mind. I don't always find it easy to find optimism about the future. But I do think that there are important things that we can do together that are also fun and enjoyable and fulfilling. And it's definitely those relationships that kind of keep me coming back, whether for accountability or just, comfort, or to share a cool new idea that I encountered. And so I think it's not to say that every thing that we're going to have to do along our path to utopia is going to be the most fun possible option, but I think it's important that we're making sure that we are doing these things in ways that are sustainable, because if they're not, it's generally a good sign that the work is not actually being done in a very solarpunk, decentralized, distributed, shared way. So I think I've used that as a kind of home base to find my hope.